I want to start by congratulating the TIPS Forum this year for selecting this theme, because I think that this is a major challenge that we are confronting as a continent and as a country. How do we promote regional industrialization through, among other things, developing regional value chains? And I think that not only is this a major challenge, but it's one where a research input and a very well-crafted and rigorous research input at that is actually very necessary. So let me just make a few points about the broad directions that we see as government and also as the continent us moving in terms of regional integration and regional industrialization. Why? What are the focuses, and where are the institutional processes that are intending to give effect to this vision? So the first point I want to make is that if you listen to any number of African leaders who speak and articulate the way they see the future of the African continent, having improved its growth performance and all of that, and having been identified as the next growth frontier, where do they see this process going? Any number of them will say that the continent has got to move up the value chain and has got to industrialize. That's what any number of them will tell you. Very good reasons for this. Those good reasons are, among other things, that the drivers of growth that took place in the previous period are no longer present in the same way that they were before. What I mean by this, in many cases, growth was driven in the continent by something called the mineral commodity supercycle. And the countries that are now the oil producers have been the last to join the rest of us in seeing that the bonanza and the rents that were available from the mineral commodity supercycle are not available in the same way that they were before. And I think that we've also got to understand that this is not just a cyclical matter, that we can hang around and wait and hope that the price of all these mineral commodities is going to bounce back up again because this is cyclical. This is also structural. It's got to do with the fact that the biggest demander of many of those mineral commodities, industrial minerals in particular, the People's Republic of China, is changing its growth strategy, is moving up the value chain, is emphasizing consumption in its own economy and moving into a more diversified services economy, and that is actually a much less mineral commodity intensive growth path than the previous growth path that it was on. And there's nobody around it, and by the looks of it, that's going to jump in and fill the gap in the same way. In South Africa, if you look at the current iteration of our industrial policy action plan, you'll see there they say, well, the obvious need of South Africa is that we need to promote higher levels of inclusive economic growth. I want to emphasize the inclusive part of it, but high levels of growth. And the analysis that is coming out of the IPAP is saying, well, if we look back over the 84 quarters that preceded the end of last year, that takes us into 1993, we had growth of 5% in only 16 of them, 16 of the 84 quarters. And what was it that drove the growth during those periods? Well, it was consumption, and it was the mineral commodity supercycle. With the balance of trade as it is, we can't any longer expect to live on a consumption-driven growth path, and nor can we rely any longer, as I've already made the point, on a commodity supercycle. So what we've got to do, we've got to move up the value chain. This corresponds with all sorts of other pieces of research or data that we can just mention. I've quoted this one, maybe many of you have heard this one before, but I think it just tells the story. It's a study by KPMG, which is called Africa Risen, which was done last year, presented last year. And they said that Africa produces and exports coffee, which receives 6 billion rand of value. $6 billion rather, US dollars of value. But that coffee is converted into products, is blended, is packaged, is whatever else they do to it, outside of the borders of the African continent that fetch $100 billion. In other words, $6 billion of the $100 billion value chain only is captured by the production and export of raw coffee beans. Another example they gave is that Italy earns more from the production and export of gold jewelry than South Africa does from the production and export of gold. I think these are all examples that the real value in global value chains is not to be found in the primary production stage of the value chains. In other words, the worst place to be integrated into global value chains is as a producer and exporter of primary products and as an importer of finished goods. Even if we were to say that many jobs were to be created in service sectors, I think there's enough evidence around now that is telling us that those service sectors will be more secure and also of a higher quality if they are part of an economy whose productive base is diversifying and moving up the value chain, rather than if they are simply footloose like Cyprus banks, for example, were. So I think that all of these are factors which lead the continent to say that the next phase of African growth has got to be driven by industrial development, diversification, moving up the value chain, and inserting the continent into a different place in the global division of labor. And I think that that is something which is the product of big debates. We were very active in those debates as South Africa. Big debates, but now there is a consensus around some of this, and many of the regional integration programs are addressing themselves to this, what I think is increasingly seen as an imperative of promoting industrialization on the continent. If you look again at the situation of South Africa and some of the industrial development drivers which we identify in our IPAP, you will see a couple of things. First of all, we have a consistent trade surplus in the African continent, and our exports to the African continent have a higher proportion of value-added products than our exports elsewhere. Of course, it is our objective in all of our external trade relations to try to promote value-added exports. Wherever we are, we try to promote more value-added exports, but the fact of the matter is, of course, and I think for good historic reasons, it's well understood that the African continent is where we have a significant presence in our trade basket of value-added exports. If we look at our drivers, a number of them, I think, speak directly to the continued processes in the region, where we see, for example, that among the drivers are infrastructure-driven industrialization, where I think that we're looking, of course, to use our own domestic infrastructure program and some of the localization measures that go along with that to drive a reindustrialization, particularly focusing on capital goods, transport equipment sectors. But also I think we're seeing that those firms must also become part of a continental process as well, where infrastructure development programs will also take place and provide opportunities there. Mineral beneficiation. I think that these are very, very hard nuts to crack, but I think that we can see that if we act together as a region and a continent, we will be able to affect some of the policy changes that are required to support mineral beneficiation more easily than if we just act as individual countries. And then the other one is the one which is the focus of attention here, is regional value chains. How can we develop regional value chains that support industrialization, not just in South Africa, but also in the broader continent and region? And if that gives rise to growth, a new growth spurt on the continent, it will be a growth spurt that will benefit industrial development here in South Africa as well. And so I think that that is the sort of background and the perspectives on regional industrialization that we support as South Africa, and that we're also seeing increasingly large numbers of other countries on the continent are also supporting. So how does this then lead into the approach that we've been taking on regional integration? I think it was mentioned by the speaker from UN WIDA when he said that we're not going to be seeing the SADC Customs Union anytime soon. A few years ago, the debate on regional integration was a debate about deepening integration within existing regional communities. It was about setting time frames for SADC to move beyond the current free trade area that is in existence in SADC into a customs union, and also then into things like monetary union. That was the focus of attention, to move to move further up Jacob Weiner's ladder of regional integration, and to see this as the focuses of attention of the debate on regional integration. Now, we were, as South Africa, extremely wary of those debates. We started to ask ourselves and ask some very fundamental questions. What does the movement from a free trade area to a customs union, what does this bring in terms of opportunities to promote intra-regional trade? And the answers that were coming even from the researchers that were doing the research is nothing. Because if you have a free trade area, you already have duty-free trade among yourselves. The customs union simply means you add on top of that a common external tariff. And people were telling us that there were advantages because we could lock in low tariffs towards the world as a whole, and we would then benefit because we would somehow or other be integrated into global value chains. And I think that that kind of approach to integration into global value chains was extremely simplistic and didn't take account of a number of very, very important dynamics in the global economy. We have, for example, as South Africa, we have, I think, successfully managed to integrate one of our sectors into global value chains. That's the automotive sector, where we were producing essentially for a local market, and then we changed the programs in the 1990s, and we've managed to integrate our productive activities into global value chains. That required a pretty significant and pretty costly effort by government to achieve that. That didn't come simply on the basis of trade liberalization. We've seen other examples practically. There was a company in Cape Town that was an international company. It was bought by another international company. It produced fire alarms. And that company came in and said, okay, now you're part of our global value chain. We're taking all the manufacturing business elsewhere. You're going to be a depot for our products. Unfortunately, in that case, the managers worked with our team, and we managed to establish a local South African company which is producing better products than they used to produce before. But as an example, that integration into global value chains simply on the basis of a trade policy stance does not necessarily mean that you get industrial development of it. You can actually get precisely the opposite, deindustrialization. And so I think that we said we can't see the benefits of this. We were, by the way, supposed by next year to have monetary union in SADC, the old Regional Indicative Strategic Development Program, RISDP. We were supposed to have had a customs union by 2010, and we were supposed to have had a monetary union by 2016. Now, I think if you just think a bit about Greece in a monetary union with a currency which is set by a stronger economy, apart from all the debt issues that Greece is facing, the country's faced massive deindustrialization. Is that a model that we want to bring in? And isn't the whole approach, I think this is what we ended up saying, isn't the whole approach shaped by a view that in Europe or elsewhere they have something like this, and that somehow or other we think that we are more integrated if we prioritize institutional arrangements of a high ambition of this sort over developments on the ground. And I think that's the real issue. Because even if you go back to the work of Jacob Weiner, when he talked about embarking on regional integration, he argued that regional integration made sense where you had high levels of complementarity, where one country produced what the other country needed and vice versa. And that was the case in Europe, where you had industrialized countries. In Africa, many of the barriers to intra-regional trade are not actually to be found in the fact that we've got high customs duties between ourselves, but rather they're to be found in the nature of the productive sectors, where we're not producing goods that find markets in each other's countries, because we are producers and exporters of copper and producers and exporters of iron ore, and we don't have much to trade with each other if that's our place in the global division of labor. And so the issues are actually much more about promoting real economy diversification and addressing some of the other serious concrete barriers to intra-regional trade, which are to be found in things like inadequate infrastructure, which doesn't connect us up one to another, but rather connects the mine to the port. And then even if you want to go into things like soft infrastructure, border arrangements and other regulations, which are often more important than tariffs. And I think that out of this, and perhaps without it being theorized at the beginning, but I think that we can theorize it in this way now, I think that what we have come to the conclusion, most of us, and this is the consensus, and this is driving the current programs, is that at this moment in time at the least, what we need is not to deepen regional integration within existing regional communities, but actually we need to broaden regional integration at FTA level across our existing regional communities, but within a framework which is developmental. In other words, we need a development integration approach. And I think that, again, there's a number of very, very practical reasons why this is the case. And again, I think they've probably got to do with the state of the world economy and where we find ourselves right now. Again, let's take China. Let's take India. Where are they seeking to drive the next phase of their industrialization and economic diversification? Well, it's at the very least, it's walking on two legs. The domestic market is one of the important legs that they are now emphasizing to a greater degree than before. The idea that we could all go out and flood the EU and the US with manufactured goods and that would be the driver of industrial development, even if that existed at some earlier phase, and I think there's a question mark over that, it certainly doesn't exist now. Because the United States, Europe, all the countries that are around there are themselves trying to reindustrialize. And they are becoming much less receptive to large influxes of new goods coming from other parts of the world. And in fact, the state of their economies is not such that there is a growing demand for new products coming from elsewhere. And the fact of the matter is, though, that those countries, emerging markets, which are trying to walk on two legs, have all got large populations and a large domestic market, not a small domestic market. And so I think here comes the challenge for Africa. Colonialism divided us into 54 different countries. None of us, certainly not South Africa, I would argue not even Nigeria, has got a domestic market which is sizable enough to support industrial development and diversification. But if we start looking across our countries, if we start looking beyond our regions, in fact, if we start looking beyond SADC, and we start looking at SADC, COMESA, and the East African Community, we start to hit the numbers that do make sense at that level. We start to talk about 500 to 600 million people. We start to talk about something like a combined GDP of over $1 trillion US dollars. If we look at the African continent as a whole, we're talking 2 billion. We're talking, we're talking 2 trillion US dollars. We're talking a population which is about 1.5 billion people. We start to hit the numbers that do provide the basis for supporting regional development and economic diversification. And so I think that we're coming up, perhaps it is that we've been walking across the stepping stones one by one, and there have been accidental things, and I think they were things like the fact that we had overlapping memberships in SADC and COMESA in particular that drove us into this project. But I think that in the end of the day, the project and the definition of the project is the right way to go, broadening integration within a developmental paradigm. And so where are we at in this process? And where are we at in the continent? Well, I think that the first thing to say is that it doesn't, of course, mean that there is no trade integration component. There is a trade integration component. We have to have an FTA in place. We have to have an FTA in place, not least because all of us in different regions are negotiating something like this with the European Union. And if we don't, we will be trading with each other on worse terms than the European Union. That can't be the basis of developing regional value chains. So we do need an FTA in place. So we've been on this journey for some time now. We basically said, and I think pragmatically so, that we're not going to try to reopen the trade arrangements that exist within each regional community. So we're not going to reopen the SADC trade protocol. We're going to focus instead on negotiations with countries or groups of countries with which each of us do not have any kind of trade preference. So we will move across the tripartite area like that. We had a summit in Sharm el-Sheikh. I was there last month, and this summit adopted the legal agreement for the establishment of the tripartite FTA, and it also set a time frame of 1 year to conclude the outstanding, which actually is the majority of the tariff schedule negotiations that have been started in one form or another. In our case, we have already exchanged offers and had a few rounds of negotiations with the East African community. When I say us, it's SACU. We have to work as the Southern African Customs Union. The SACU East African community, that negotiation has started. We are pretty close to finalizing our offer, which we will submit to Egypt. That does leave a few. There's quite a few actually. There's Egypt, there's Ethiopia, there's Djibouti, there's Sudan. There's quite a number of others, but I think the two main ones are on track, and I think we can, certainly in our outstanding negotiation, we can actually conclude that by the end of the year. But the approach is not just FTA negotiations. The approach is also supposed to be infrastructure development. I think Donald Kaberuka said a little while ago that the infrastructure deficit on the African continent was costing the continent the equivalent of 2% growth. There is an infrastructure deficit which is not being covered by existing funding mechanisms. The infrastructure project that goes along with the TFTA is the North-South Corridor. Some progress, but also still some challenges to build the infrastructure that's at stake. One of the reasons why we have been so keen on the BRICS New Development Bank, which is now up and running, is that, and why the first regional office will be established here in South Africa, is because we see that there is an opportunity to tap into other funds which can, among other things, support regional infrastructure development across the African continent and provide greater connectivity between our countries. The industrial development pillar, however, is very, very behind at the tripartite level. What we did do, though, was at the SADC level, there was a special conference that took place about a month or so ago of SADC, which was entirely devoted to the development of the SADC industrial development strategy. That strategy, I don't know if you've seen it, I think it's worth looking at, is a piece of work which I think we can say is a strategy document. I often compare it to our own National Industrial Policy Framework. It covers much of the same sort of ground. It indicates the domain of potential actions which can be taken to support industrial development, with a big focus and a big expectation on regional value chains. And the other critical issue that I think we're all going to have to confront is the question of financing. Because the observation is made, which was the same observation we made when we introduced the first iteration of our current industrial policy action plans, is that private credit extension does not go to support productive investment. By and large, it goes to support consumption-driven activities. And the question of the role of development finance institutions and what these might mean in terms of regional industrial development, these are going to be massive, massive challenges as we move further forward. At the level of the continent, let's just say, of course, the AU had reached the obvious conclusion from the tripartite process, and of course it is a really critical question for us as well. What about the rest of the continent? What about West Africa? What about the rest of North Africa? Because Egypt and Libya are part of the tripartite. What about the rest of North Africa and of West Africa? And so the conclusion was reached that, well, we need to move towards a continental FTA, which is a journey that we also support. The negotiations for that were opened at the AU summit that was held here in Johannesburg, but the time frame, let me just put it this way as diplomatically as I can, is extremely ambitious. The negotiations are supposed to be concluded by 2017, and that is including also a trading services component, which in the tripartite is put into phase 2, but in phase 1, the current phase of negotiations at the continental level is supposed to include a trading services component as well. So let me say that I think that's a sort of a description of where these processes are at the moment. Let me conclude with a few remarks about some of the challenges. I think first of all, the issue that you're all here to talk about, regional value chains, is one of the critical ones. We've identified, I think, in very, very broad conceptual terms, that there are things called regional value chains that can include manufacturing which involves inputs from different parts of the region or the continent, and that the identification and development of these is a critical component of African industrialization. And I think that is one of the challenges. And I think that actually getting down and dirty and really understanding and analyzing what are these regional value chains. Sometimes people talk about, well, auto component manufacturing can go to other countries, and some of us, like South Africa, can be the automotive manufacturers and things like that. Well, I think that there is a bit of migration that takes place here and there, but how and what should we be doing to support an inclusive set of industrial activities? Because I think the temptation of some countries is not to see the regional value chain as the driver of industrial development, but the domestic market. And that can lead to people saying, well, we didn't have the industrial pillar in place when we had the SADC trade protocol, and therefore there's no need for us to respect the SADC trade protocol. And I think that what that would mean in practice would mean undermining a tool that could be in place that could support the emergence and development of regional value chains. For South Africa, we have, of course, supermarkets and exporters in all countries with a high proportion of South African products on sale. I think that this model of us is going to have to change. We're going to have to move into a different spot in regional value chains. And here I think there's a couple of examples that I think are telling us the way, practical examples. We are, for example, or we were, and I think this will continue under the new administration, but we were involved in very earnest engagements with Nigeria about the Nigerian automotive program. We were providing them with quite a bit of technical input into the design of their program. And at the same time, I think we're at the point where we are looking for South African companies to be suppliers into the Nigerian market of components that will be used in semi-knockdown kit assembly, and also some of the finished built-up units that would enter under the program. That's the sort of thing that I think we're talking about. So as Nigeria begins to manufacture vehicles, maybe some of those will find their way into South Africa as well. I think that's the kind of model that we're looking at as well. Secondly, another practical example, I had the opportunity to attend the opening of an investment by a consortium including Score Metals. They had established a plant to manufacture grinding material for the West African mining industry in Accra in Ghana. And now before that, this grinding material was imported from South Africa. Now there's a plant there, manufacture that, but the components into that will come from South Africa. So I think that these are the sort of signs on the wall, if you like, that we're going to have to find ourselves occupying a somewhat different place in these value chains. We're going to have to move up. What is that location for South Africa? What is the location for other countries? How do we promote an inclusive industrialization based on regional value chains? And perhaps resist the temptation with very small markets to say, well, this is going to be at the national market's going to be the driver, to hell with the regional integration, and so on and so forth. I think that's going to be one of the very, very critical issues. The other one I was saying was the question of finance, investment and finance. Now I think that doesn't all come from DFIs. We can be promoting some foreign investment in industrial activities. I think that sometimes we have to tell people in this country that the investment pipeline into manufacturing, despite what may be happening in mining or in terms of the portfolio investments, is actually holding up reasonably well, because quite a number of companies are making the bet that the regional market will integrate, that South Africa is critical in the industrial development of the African continent, and that this is a place that they need to invest in productive manufacturing activity. We've seen this in a number of different sectors that this is taking place. But how do we address, I think, the question of industrial financing? That, I think, is a very, very critical question. So let me then just conclude with where I started. I think that the stage we are in, the period that we find ourselves in, is one where a very significant research input is required. In the case of SADC, I said the strategy is a strategy which is at the level of identifying the potential domain of actions that can be taken to support industrial development across SADC. The mandate that was given to the Secretariat was that this must be turned into an action plan that must be tabled for adoption next year. So the clock is ticking, and the identification in particular of regional value chains and how we promote some kind of inclusive involvement in regional value chains is, I think, critically important. And the last point I'd make is that we then face, I think, I'm going next week to a discussion about the WTO. How do we defend the policy space to develop and support regional value chains against what I think will be a series of demands for industrial tariff lowering, with the ostensible benefit that we will have access to markets that are very distant from us, and where the benefit, I think, is more hypothetical, but the risk is that the regional value chains will be undermined by the import of finished products coming from outside of the region. So I think that's the last point I would make. So welcome the focus of this TIPS forum. Wish you well and look forward to receiving a report of the outcomes, and I hope that you have a good and valuable conference. Thank you very much.